Welcome to Dataless You. I'm Paul, coming to you from Brooklyn. Today we're going to take a look at Buddhist psychology, specifically the five Skandhas, which are a kind of theory of perception and self. I'm excited today to deliver my first lecture on Buddhism, a subject about which I am very passionate. So let's get started. The idea today is to give a brief overview of the theory of the five skandhas, and specifically to look at how this ancient theory of psychology, or really of a kind of phenomenology, is applicable to our lives. And I'm going to give you my own personal view of the theory and of why it's important to me. So first, let's look at this word skanda. From the Sanskrit or the Pali, is translated into English, probably best as heap or aggregate, we'll often see. In other words, a big pile. So in shortest formulation possible, the theory of the five skandhas posits that a human being is made up of a heap of perceptions, and that there is no essential, absolute, concrete self, right? At the bottom or at the core of this great big heap and wave and roller coaster of unending experience of moment after moment. So, to give you a sort of vision of where this is all heading, this ancient theory arrives at the conclusion that, again, there is no self. Now, this is a well-known Buddhist postulate that confuses many students. How could there be no self? I certainly seem to have a self. What exactly is then reincarnated if there is no self, etc., etc.? There's all kinds of conundrums and problems to be worked out later. But let's just work with this basic idea that the five skandhas posit that I am but, again, a pile is really my favorite word, a heap or an aggregate, a pile of perceptions. And that besides that, there is no core or absolute self. So let's see how it works. Skanda number one is form or rupa. I'm not really going to address the Sanskrit or the Pali. We'll just sort of look at the English, but I have it up there for students of Buddhism. Form is, as you see here, earth, water, fire, and air. It's really the stuff of life, what scientists would call matter. Notice it includes the sense organs, so the eye itself, but also that which I see with my eye, or the ear itself, but also the melody, which is a thing. It has a beginning, a middle, and end. It has a shape, right? It has contour. So, all the stuff of life, what we might think of as the concreteness of a table, that's the first skanda. In other words, the first stage. You might think of these as stages of perception, of how we are in the world, of how we perceive the world. Now, this last bullet point, co-arising with awareness, is crucial. So I just want to spend a moment here explaining that one. Really, the crux of this theory is that the skandhas, or in this case, let's just say the form, the matter of life, is co-arising with awareness itself, or my own consciousness, right? So you can't have one without the other. You might think of the riddle, if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, well, does it make a sound? Well, I guess it's supposed to be an unanswerable riddle, but according to the theory of the five skandhas, no, it doesn't really make a sound. Because the sound of the tree falling has to meet with awareness, right? And it's really the co-arising of awareness, and in this case, the sound, the auditory thing of the sound of a tree falling, that make up skanda number 1, which again is form. So I think this one's relatively accessible. It's really just the stuff, as we might say, of life. Let's take a look at skanda number 2, feeling. So this is the primitive sensation of pleasure, pain, or neutrality that we get when any form arises. Again, it's momentary and fleeting, as are all of the skandhas. In fact, at the end, you'll notice they all kind of come together, and they're all happening instantaneously. And in order to investigate them more thoroughly, of course, the practice of meditation is recommended. And you might almost imagine the Buddha or the earliest practitioners of meditation exploring this theory and having so finely tuned their awareness that they could see or perceive how essentially each moment of awareness is constructed, right? So they sort of split it up into these stages, which essentially are happening for us really instantaneously. So I like stage 2 here, feeling. Let's use an everyday analogy to maybe make more sense of this one. Let's say you walk into a crowded cocktail party. So without much perception at all, I might almost feel that to my right is the bar. Now, I might not even name it that yet, but I can kind of see people massed there, or you can kind of sense a pull, right? So that's going to be a positive pull maybe over towards that area. Whereas perhaps on my left, I have some flash, and maybe over on my left is an ex-girlfriend, and so there we have the negativity, the negative pole, and maybe I'm sort of well, I don't want to say repulsed, but in a physical sense, repulsed from that side of the room. So just the kind of gut feeling we have, and you can play this game with any object. Almost any object in the world is going to carry with it some sort of feeling. Again, before you even name something, some sort of musical instrument, might lend something in your own perception of a kind of positivity, right? Again, you could think of sort of feng shui in the way, one thinks of arranging one's household or one's bedroom. All of these things come into play, the feeling that form gives us. Okay, let's take a look at stage 3. 3 and 4, I think, are where things get most interesting. So the third skanda is called perception. I'll read here the definition from my teacher, Reggie Ray, who wrote, "It's the rudimentary perception in which we recognize and type what we see, hear, smell, taste, touch, and think." So I call it more or less the naming stage, where concept is introduced. It's still rather impulsive, though, so we don't want to get ahead of ourselves. But if you're, say, walking through the woods, and you have just kind of a general holistic sensation of trees and leaves and maybe grass underfoot, then suddenly a rabbit hops across your path. Well, that rabbit is going to occupy your perceptual field, and it will probably instantly occur to you that it is in fact a rabbit, right? And so the name kind of comes with the form and with the feeling that you might have towards it. I'm getting a perception now of passing fire trucks outside my window. I'm sure you can hear them. So that's the third stage, right? We sort of begin to name things, and notice how concept enters into it. Let's look at the fourth, and in my opinion, the most fascinating stage, which is called Karmic Formulations. So let's read this in its entirety. This stage it gives rise to habitual concepts, identification, labels, and judgments. Now, to me, those are all sort of a step more advanced from a simple name, right? You could think of prejudice arising here, right? All kinds of mental baggage, associations, and memories attached to the first three skandhas. So let's go back to my cocktail party example. I was sort of getting ahead of myself when I used the ex-girlfriend example, because certainly there, that negative impulse, away from the left-hand side of the room is probably due in part to the associations and memories I have of my relationship with said ex-girlfriend. Right, but notice how it's almost instantaneously. It's not like I'm sitting there thinking of all the awful times we had, but there's an imprint, right, of every experience we had, good and bad, right? But maybe that last argument's imprint is a little stronger, and so there's this kind of negativity associated with this particular perception in my consciousness. Keep in mind, all of these are co-arising, right? So there's form and there's awareness, right? You might use the analogy of Newton's third law of physics, right? So for every action, there's an equal and opposite reaction. In other words, you can't have a fist pounding against the wall unless you in fact have the wall pounding back against the fist. So, maybe that is a simple enough analogy to think about how it's always form and the awareness arising with the form that gives rise to this perception, this being in the world. So notice how the fourth stage here, the karmic formulation, is the one that really, in Buddhist sort of discussion, gives rise to a certain degree of problematics, right? Habitual patterns, right? The way we always respond to things. Let's continue to pursue the ex-girlfriend analogy or example. Right, if I allow stage 4, you're right, so associations, memories, all this karmic baggage to arise in my awareness, and let me use this word, kind of dominate my awareness, well, in a way that's impurifying the experience. And we'll talk a little bit more about the takeaway from this teaching in just a moment, but, to give you a kind of a peek, if I could hang back into, just hang back, let go of the karmic baggage and hang back in a sort of pure perception, maybe just stage 1, and it's just a woman, right? Maybe a beautiful woman, right? Maybe even stage 2 starts to be spun more to the positive. If I don't allow myself to always immediately leap into this stage 4 of karmic baggage, right? In other words, if we can always just meet people in the moment and accept that they're a human being in the world at this very moment, at this fresh and utterly new moment, then perhaps we're being a little bit more fair to one another. For all we know, my ex-girlfriend has undergone great change and is just a tremendous, beautiful, virtuous person whom I'd love to have a conversation with. But of course, I'll never know if I continue to label and judge, right? So stage 4 is very interesting, and we could talk at length about it. But in short, it's where all our kind of habitual and karmic identifications and judgments arise. And they, of course, arise from past experience, from past imprints that linger, that hang around. The 5th stage just kind of tidies things up. It's called the consciousness stage. In a word, I would call it the field, right? So it's a kind of circumscribed, self-referential field of awareness which contains essentially all of the stages. To quote again my teacher Reggie Ray, he says, "Within the field is our consciousness governed by motives of self-protection and territoriality." So let's unpack that quote a little bit. Essentially, and you could look further into this philosophy, and there's some discussion of Skandhas 6, 7, and 8, but essentially at this point there's a kind of circumscribing of self, right? So all of this perception has taken place literally in an instant. Again, I've described it in a sort of sequential way, but it all happens rather instantaneously. And it's in that moment where we identify self and other, right? So me as self and ex-girlfriend as other, or just me as self and general room, general atmosphere as other, me as self and bar on the right-hand side as other. This perpetual psychological process is what, according to Buddhist philosophy, causes one's sense of self, right? But this kind of analytical philosophy, this way of looking more closely at how these perceptions arise and how these moments arise, is one way of observing that in fact we are nothing but heaps and piles of perception. So let's take a look at the takeaway. As I mentioned in the beginning, the takeaway here is egolessness, which is the sort of modern word for the Buddhist concept of no self, right? No self, no absolute, concrete, actual self. You can't just take my frontal cortex and call that myself, or my whole brain, or my heart even, right? There is nothing fundamentally here that we can call self. Rather, self is a heap of co-arising incidents of awareness and form, right? Or self is heaps of co-arising skandhas. So, if that is in fact the sort of takeaway, right? How do we, actually apply this kind of teaching in our everyday lives? Well, first of all, meditation is recommended, right? So, in the process of meditation, you can begin to observe how even the sensation of breath, which itself is a kind of form, right? It's air. That was one of the four elements, the basic four elements. Even as the air comes in, sort of does its thing and then goes out, even that form, which has a beginning, a middle, and an end, doesn't sort of point to any essential self. It's just merely another perception in a wave, in a series of waves of perceptions. So through the practice of meditation, and it's interesting, I recommend checking it out. With this in mind, with this sort of analytical philosophy in mind, you can sort of sit and have a formal sitting practice and observe. Observe how, say, the sound of a fire truck passing outside your window is just merely yet another coincidence of my awareness and what we like to think of as the outside world, right? And secondly, right, so first is take this and bring it into your formal practice and see what happens. And secondly, kind of more direct application might be, as I said, to try to hang back as much as you can in the first skanda or two. Um, in other words, you might think of the simplicity of a child. I mean, even an infant or a toddler's perspective on the world. They're not naming things. They're not judging things. They're not carrying a great deal of karmic baggage. They don't have ex-girlfriends, for example. They don't have relationships with bars. But even a child, is going to reach out maybe to a flower, right? Because there's a color, there's an arrangement of the petals, the Fibonacci spiral that is aesthetically pleasing to some in some fundamental way. Or another analogy on the other end of the spectrum would be under the influence of certain hallucinogenics. I mean, I think this is really the draw to altered states of consciousness. You kind of pull back a little bit, and you're seeing the world more, you might say, rawly, right? It's just you and form, and a little bit of positive and negative. You might stare at something for 10 minutes before you realize it's just an orange. You're like, oh, it's an orange. But you've had this experience with the shape of it and the color of it. And I think that is a big pull to that experience because it's a taste of what pure perception is, of what living in a world of just form and feeling might be like. Now, of course, that's kind of a tall order, right? Because as I said, this all happens instantaneously, right? If I see a lobster, I might instantly think about the time that I ate lobster and vomited violently for 8 hours. So, karmic baggage is powerful. And it's not something that we can just sort of, erase, right, through a couple hours of study or of meditation practice. But still, there's a kind of underlying message of what the phrase pure perception might mean, right? And to me, that's appealing, right? I do want to face people, for example, in the moment and not label and identify and judge. I think this is important, right? Even if it's somebody I've had a fight with that morning or the night before. The next time I see that person, can I face that person in the moment? Right? Can I be with that person without carrying too much judgment into the situation? And lastly, thirdly, forget the whole point two, and just think if we can just observe this process, right? Either in formal practice or just in everyday life, in our experience with the world. If we can see how these skandhas, do indeed describe the way we are fundamentally in the world, the way our awareness interacts with, again, the so-called outside world, then I think that it lends a certain perspective, and one that can be fruitful. So I'll leave you here with a picture of my teacher's teacher, the great Chogyam Trungpa Rinpoche. And I, as always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the future.